Afterward, the students all said their goodbyes and trooped off into the hot Tucson evening, and Elizabeth and I sat around on the cool concrete of the front porch and talked. I don't remember really what we talked about exactly because I was gathering impressions more than information. But my main impression was that I was dealing with someone smart, perceptive, and exceptionally kind. My first novel wouldn't have been published if it weren't for Elizabeth. She was my thesis advisor, even though she was technically on sabbatical when most professors won't even return their emails. I'm still grateful to her for that, and we've been friends ever since. A splendid writer, a generous teacher, and a great friend, Elizabeth Evans.
Thank you. I'm just thinking of that night that I met Carrie, and I made an Indian dinner, and I think he came in and he said, I think that the lentils may be burning. He was right. He saved the day. So thank you for coming out tonight. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book. Skip around just a little bit, but this will basically be from part 1 of As Good as Dead. The fateful morning, no exaggeration, fateful, that my long-lost friend, Esme Cole, showed up on our front steps. I was sitting at the desk in the room that I used for a home office. My chair, I remember, made an uneasy perch, all slippery and lopsided because I hadn't bothered to remove the items that I dumped on the seat the night before. A manila folder crammed with information about a job applicant being considered by the English department, a puke green envelope holding an entry for a book prize I'd reluctantly agreed to judge, and then a 3-ring binder of my own writing that creaked whenever I shifted in the chair. The sky in the window over my desk was a clear blue that morning. The temperature outside would climb into the high 80s as the day progressed, but the room faced north and its exterior wall still held the cold that settled in on desert nights. This was October in Tucson, Arizona, which meant that the ancient space heater at the level of my feet pinged away, giving off a metallic odor that might have been unpleasant to somebody else. I connected it with my writing and comfort, and so I liked it. Esme Cole Fletcher, I should call my long-lost friend. Esme Cole, betrayed by me 20 years before, did take the name of the man she married. Once upon a time, she and I had vowed to keep our own names forever. But this is a tale about nothing, if not about changes of heart. When Esme rang our doorbell that morning, an obnoxious thing, door drill was more like it, I jumped in my desk chair, swore. Telephones ringing, doorbells drilling. I always preferred to let my husband, Will, answer. He was better at handling that sort of thing. And who could be at the door at 11-something in the morning anyway? Our house sat in an older part of Tucson that, although encircled by neighborhoods with conventional sidewalks and lawns and paved streets, remained staunchly gravel roads, home to coyotes, Gambel's quail, and even the occasional long-tusked javelina. Apart from friends in a formal mood on nights when they brought flowers or wine for a dinner party, the only people who used our front door were UPS drivers, evangelists, and those poor teenage boys lugging around styrofoam coolers of candy, whose profits each sweating kid swore by rote would keep him off the streets and away from a life of drugs and crime. Still, I got up from my desk. Will liked the living room drapes closed. I preferred them open, but was less consistent about carrying out my wishes, which was a boon that morning, since it allowed me to peek out at the caller from a slit between the panels. A stout, red-faced woman stood on our front steps, boxy olive pantsuit, cropped hair the color of Vaseline. Partly turned away, she was just a profile with a single eye squinting against the Arizona sunshine. Impossible for me to have guessed that this was the Esme Cole, who had been a student with me back at the Iowa Writers Workshop in 1988, my roommate in a brick apartment house on Burlington Street. That Esme Cole had been stylish and slim in retro capris, vintage cashmere cardigans, a lovely 25-year-old with a bushel basket of red hair pinned up in a cloud of glorious dishevelment. Brave, I'd thought, wearing your hair that way, like keeping a swan for a pet, and walking the thing around town, an announcement that you knew you were fabulous. Could the woman on the front steps be a Jehovah's Witness panting to hand over a copy of the Watchtower? But didn't witnesses travel in pairs, and didn't the women wear dresses? I definitely did not want to open the door, but I worried over that Pepto-Bismol pink face, and those blocky hands hanging so inert and glossy and red they could have been shrink-wrapped packs of hamburger. Suppose the woman was one of those poor souls discombobulated by our quiet neighborhood's gravel roads that look like driveways, and driveways that look like roads. She'd hoped to get in a walk this morning, but now had resigned herself to asking for directions and a glass of water. Suppose she was looking for a lost pet, or worse, a lost child who'd wandered off into this semi-wilderness of cacti, rattlesnakes, the occasional grandfathered-in swimming pool with no proper safety fence around it. The bulky Esme Cole Fletcher, who stood on Will's and my front steps, she looked so different from the Esme whom I remembered that even after I had opened the inner door and she said her name through the screen, I needed her teasing reprimand, "Charlotte, c'est moi," before a current began to flow between us. Weak at first, then that dull, chunky lady began to acquire a soft glow, and it was Esme. And joy is what I felt, alongside a dread that must have made my face go white. Yes, in 1988 there had been lovely times between my workshop friend and myself, such as a fall morning when side by side we knelt on the kitchen linoleum and dent by dent, using the nails of our little fingers, pressed our names, Charlotte, Esme, into the many coats of built-up yellowed enamel on the cupboards. Even better, once we finished, Esme added a plus sign between our names, Esme plus Charlotte, as if we were sweethearts. Also true, at the end of that year's Thanksgiving vacation, I had spent an idiotic blotto evening sloshing around on the chilly waterbed of Esme's workshop boyfriend, an Alabamian named Jeremy Fletcher, whom I generally regarded as a giant blowhard. The worst thing I ever did in my entire life, betraying not only my friend, but also Will, off in Italy at the time. A thoroughly ridiculous person, that was what I had been. Amazingly enough, neither Will nor Esme learned of that drunken mess, and shortly afterward, Esme became pregnant, and Jeremy Fletcher declared he could not ride up north, and the two married and left for Mobile. How lucky I felt in that period of reprieve, maybe 18 months, in which Esme wrote me long letters bewailing her inability to find a friendship even close to ours, but also reported pleasure in her new life as a Southern wife and then a mother. On behalf of her baby, I learned to knit, and a Madame Defarge of Repentance created an Afghan of a turquoise so remarkably pale that it looked like something you could blow away with a sigh. "Hated tearing open your brown paper package tied up with string," Esme wrote to me in her charming letter of thanks. "It looked like the greatest hot cross bun of all time, but the contents were even finer, you dear girl." Then her letter stopped. No explanation. I assumed that Jeremy Fletcher had confessed to his and my evening on his waterbed. My guilt festered. I excoriated myself for not confessing. If you had been braver, you rat, she would not have married the man who by now she probably realizes is a rat too. I had grieved, but after a year or two finally gave up writing letters that never received a response. They had started to feel bizarre. I never could include an apology after all, since I did not know what Esme knew, and I did not want to cause a marital disaster where one did not exist. Yet now here stood my old friend on my front steps, smiling what remained the most glorious of smiles, the big white-toothed Esme Cole smile that had told me to my confusion, more than any smile that I'd ever known, that I was better than okay. I was somebody special. That smile, her familiar scent of cigarette smoke and l'air de temps, my throat constricted with emotion. Inconceivable that I had betrayed my friend. Though I sensed that grabbing her in a remorseful hug might be too much, a husky Esme did escape me while I threw open the screen door. Some history. 11 years before Esme's arrival at the house, the same semester that Will had finished a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, he and I had the good fortune to win jobs at the University of Arizona. Will in art history, myself in creative writing. The week we packed for our move to Tucson, we took a break one night to attend a fundraiser at Minneapolis's Walker Art Center. Will stepped off to get a glass of wine at the bar set up for the event, and I, wisely if gloomily abstaining, went to say my goodbyes to Chuck Close's giant big self-portrait. Goodbye, bespectacled, drooping eyes, each as large as a head, shockingly gorgeous black and white bits of ash on a colossal cigarette, hanging so tipsily from pillow-sized lips. Goodbye. While I stood there so full of admiration for Chuck Close and rubbing my arms to stay warm in the museum's air-conditioned tower of brick and glass, I sensed a body detaching itself from the cluster of attendees near the bar and sidling my way. A moment later, from behind me, abrupt and loud as a honk, a voice said, "Charlotte Price." A poet I'd known slightly during my Iowa Writers Workshop days. Her height threw me initially. She had on 6-inch heels, and I couldn't think of her real name, only the one that Esme had given her, Queen Turd, in honor of her supercilious airs and the slippery-looking tawny braid that back then she'd worn coiled on top of her head. "I'm a reformed poet now," she declared with a great ha-ha. The woman always had impressed me as someone who viewed herself as a kind of celebrity, and I sensed that, like an interviewer, I was supposed to ask her to explain the reformed poet business. Of necessity, had she given up poetry the way that I'd given up alcohol, or was reformed poetry a movement? From the retro hippie look that she'd favored in the 80s, Birkenstocks and third world cottons, the poet had moved along to those towering high heels, slick charcoal knits, tony earrings made up of alternating strips of gold and anchovy cans. Gone, the turdish coil, replaced by a jet black bowl cut above a swath of skull, shaved to a high-maintenance smoke. She swigged the amber drink in her plastic cup, then squeezed my forearm and said, "I hear you've published, Charlotte." Her squeeze, I admit it stirred me. I was a sucker for a warm gesture. But before I could reply, up went her eyebrows like window shades set flying, and she added with another haw-haw, "Anything I should read?" I was almost 30 years old by then, but my party skills remained on par with those of a cuckoo clock. I could count on coming up with a little something only once an hour or so. Defending another person, I'd lost a triangle of my 2 front teeth after jumping between 2 unmatched boys in my high school's cafeteria. I was always good at that, but could be rendered perfectly dumb by a personal remark. With an arch smile, the poet swiftly shifted the conversation to gossip about workshop people, some of whom I remembered, some of whom I didn't, who'd won prizes, who hadn't. In the hubbub raised by the art patrons, I missed a lot of what the poet said, but after I mentioned that I was about to start a job in Tucson, I did hear her exclaim, "But that's where my workshop friend Esme Fletcher lives." Esme Cole Fletcher lived in Tucson? Old guilt, grief, and fear had swamped me. What would happen if we ran into each other now? And then a bit of jealousy showed up too. When and how had Esme and this woman been friends? It was Esme and I who had sat up until all hours singing songs from a little night music and creating Cindy Sherman-esque tableaus and discussing whether or not we had the right to call ourselves writers before we published our first books. Esme declared a vehement no, I an equally vehement yes. It was Esme and I who could recite poems to each other or even in tandem because before we met, both of us had memorized some of the very first works. And so I elbowed in. It was sad that Esme and I lost touch given that we were roommates and all. A sharp look. The poet set her index fingers on the stark beginnings of the black wings of her dramatic eyebrows, traced the fingers along the eyebrows to their ends, stopping at her temples. I had the queer sensation that she was preening, using me for her mirror. I was flummoxed in the way that I, a hick, the only student actually from the state of Iowa during our years at the workshop, regularly had been flummoxed by people there. Roommates, she murmured, then demonstrated that she knew all kinds of up-to-date things about Esme that I did not. There was a second son, Daniel. Esme had become a real estate broker after the boy started grade school. My surprise at the idea of Esme as a businesswoman must have shown because the poet laughed. Oh yes, unlike some of you, Esme and I have to work in the real world. She's doing well though. Jeremy sells advertising, I think, and maybe does some journalism, but Esme brings home the real money. So Esme's life was good. The news gratified me. For a moment, I even thought, suppose in Tucson she and I wind up friends again. A notion quickly followed by a firm mental correction. No, no. I scoured the Art Center's crowded lobby for a sign of Will. There, the back of his dear shaggy head, the band of skin exposed between the collar of his blue work shirt and fair hair, suggested that he was talking to someone of a more average height. At 6'5", Will regularly had a sore neck after such events. Oh, he was patient, Will was. Even if a person happened to wax on about Will's specialty, Italian futurism, Will listened, made a correction only if an error were truly egregious. Both from pride, I remained astonished that he'd chosen me, and to change the subject, I said to the reformed poet, "You remember Will Ludlow?" "The art historian," she said. "Of course. Mystery Man." I had not heard the nickname in years. It was something dreamed up by certain female graduate students at Iowa who had found Will's desire for privacy both annoying and tantalizing. I pointed across the crowded lobby. "Over there. He and I are married now." "Charlotte, congratulations." The poet held up her free hand for a high five. Easier to go along than leave my hand hanging, looking like a party pooper. She rattled her plastic cup of ice cubes at me. Trip to the bar? A toast? A familiar voice told me that running a fire hose blast of vodka around inside my brain would scour away the edgy crap filling my head. But then the voices of people from the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, to which I too infrequently dragged myself, reminded me, girl, you and alcohol never, ever are going to get to hang out together again, be any sort of pals. I think I'll just wander around a bit, I told the poet. We started to move off in different directions. Then I steeled myself and turned back and called, hey, you wouldn't happen to have Esme's address with you, would you? Later, I would flush when I noticed that the address that the poet had copied onto her cocktail napkin was not for Esme's home, but for the brokerage firm where she worked. Did the poet know about Jeremy Fletcher and me? No matter. I felt certain of my next step, and the very next day, dropping by the English department at the University of Minnesota to deliver grades for a workshop I'd taught there, I nabbed a sheet of letterhead from the front desk and carried it with me to the lunch table in the break room. There, with a fountain pen with blue-black ink can sometimes fortify me, I wrote, Dear Esme. That was as far as I got. The expanse of good ivory bond beneath Dear Esme and the handsome university insignia had opened before me as vast and daunting as Death Valley. I did not see how I could survive crossing all that space. And suppose that Esme took the stationery as showing off. Was it showing off? Or, paradoxically, trying from insecurity to let her know that I had value? Both? Curiouser and curiouser, as Alice said when she found herself telescoping taller and taller and worried that her feet, now far out of sight, might no longer be willing to carry her where she wanted to go. I tore the sheet of letterhead in half, threw it in the office recycle bin, and headed back to Will's and my duplex, which was stuffed with the cardboard boxes we'd scavenged from behind liquor and grocery stores for our move to Tucson. I located and slid open an already taped shut box labeled Charlotte's desk. It had held bananas and released a sharp stink, while from its strata of smaller boxes and bins, I removed a pretty postcard of the Ponte Vecchio at sunset that I'd rejected repeatedly over the years, as its message area was so crowded with historical information. In what now appeared a blessedly tiny space, I wrote, Dear Esme, Will and I are moving to Tucson, teaching at the U of A. Will and I had purchased a house on a chock-a-block 3-day trip to Tucson in early June, and I included its address before I closed. It would be great to see you after all these years. XO, Charlotte. An exclamation point. Maybe it was simply the writer in me, but I worried about it at the time and later. Suppose she found it fulsome. It made her want to vomit. Suppose I'd left it off and she'd written back and everything had turned out differently. After Will and I had been settled in Tucson for a month or so, and Esme hadn't contacted me, I'd driven my car north into the foothills of the Catalina Mountains. I had enough sense of the town by then to know that the brokerage firm she worked for must be upscale as it sat in Casa Sedocas Plaza. In suave black script, the firm's name scrolled across a creamy canvas awning that conveyed a sense that the people within had class. I drove by the office twice, but I could not make myself stop to say hello. Not long after, however, I did telephone, albeit very late on a Sunday, when I felt certain that no one would be in and I'd be able simply to leave a voicemail. Even so, I was incredibly nervous. Please, please, I found myself praying as soon as the telephone started to ring. Please, my shoulders tight up around my ears, let the next voice I hear be a recorded one. it was. The reprieve allowed me to sound genuinely cheerful and enthusiastic when I left my name and new telephone number. I must clarify. I would have stayed on the line if Esme had picked up the telephone. I would have been happy as a clam if she wanted to see me, but those waiting prayers of mine made it painfully clear to me that my call and earlier postcard had been, above all, preemptive strikes. By putting myself out there, pretending that never in a million years would it occur to me that Esme Cole Fletcher would be less than pleased to see her old pal, Charlotte Price. I meant to lay a path for civility. I aimed to create a world in which I would not feel obliged to jump, heart-thumping, behind a telephone pole if I saw Esme coming down a Tucson street, to duck into a restroom or an alcove at a literary event, bookstore, gallery opening. Above all, I wanted to make it possible to act surprised if Esme gave me the cold shoulder in front of Will. If she gave me the cold shoulder, Will would want to know why, and Will never, ever could know why. Anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain. Yes.
So I remember reading the short story that this started out as. Can you talk about how it expanded from that short story? What did you do?
Well, I wrote the short story and it was really long and I kept taking things out of it because I was determined to make it a short story because I was working on a novel at the time. And actually you read it and gave me some insight into it. And it was published as a short story. It was very long. It was, I think, published, it was over 40 pages. And I showed it to Nancy Miller, my editor at Bloomsbury. And she said, oh, I just love this story, but I think it needs to be a novel. And I thought, well, maybe that's why I kept having to throw all these things out of it, you know. And what happened was I really got to look at the evolution of Charlotte as the 41-year-old, and also the evolution of her thinking of how she ended up doing the stuff she did when she was young. So, you know, it's a portrait of someone who is very feels very guilty about something she did in the past, and she feels guilty in part because she has these secrets about the past. But it's also interested in, you know, why she did what she did when she did it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, she from the very start, you know, says, well, I did this lousy thing, you know. And so she, you're dealing with someone who's aware of, you know, bad behavior in the past. But I view her as a sympathetic character. I guess, you know, because I'm interested in understanding her, and I guess I do feel like I understand her. I came to understand her more. And one thing that I think you really can do with a novel is to spend more time with a character, you know. And it was fun. It was fun. Yeah.
So that explains how you expanded upon the characters. Where did the characters come from?
Where did what?
The characters come from.
Well, they were the same characters who were in the story.
Right, but I mean, where did they come from when you wrote this story, in other words?
Oh, you know, they're drawn from all kinds of people I've known in life, and then they have to do things that I made up, and I did go to the writer's workshop at Iowa, and
Aren't you from
and then I've taught it. What?
Aren't you from Iowa?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've taught in workshops for many years, so I've had a lot of experience with, you know, these kind of very competitive environments where people are trying to create art, and they're very stimulating, but there's a lot of competition, and Iowa's especially known for that atmosphere. And I just was interested in these different characters who, Charlotte's very much a small town girl. She's from Iowa. Esme's much more sophisticated, comes from more money, and interested in, this character who's so excited to have the attention of this vibrant Esme in her life. It's more complicated than what she imagines it will be.
So is competition one of the main themes?
Is what?
Is competition between these two friends one of the main themes as we read further?
It's important, yeah. Competition in general is important. So there's a investigation of female friendships as part of what's going on. They can be so intense, and important in people's lives. And sometimes there can be, kind of flip-flop, that occurs when you feel really close to someone and then you feel betrayed by them.
I think we have time for one last question. I have.
Go ahead, no, I already asked mine, you go ahead.
It's such an absorbing book. It's so well crafted, and you can hardly put it down. I'm just wondering, how did you balance creating something so absorbing while also teaching? Because you're a professor as well.
Well, I always have taught and done both at the same time, and it is part of what you're expected to do if you have a university teaching job, as the publish or perish, kind of famous dictum. And I always say to people, if you want to write, you just have to make the time for it, come hell or high water, because nobody else is going to make the time for it. And, so you have to take the time, and sometimes that means, excusing yourself from an absorbing conversation and going to write things down, or getting up early or staying up late. Most people who really want to do it, and I also say, there are so many very, very talented students that I've worked with over the years, and not all of them have kept writing, so a lot of it is just really wanting to keep plugging away at it, it's and feeling like there isn't anything I can do, but I have to do this, there's no choice.
Wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you want to do the last question?
No.
Okay.
Thank you so much.